Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomla conference. I'm delighted to have Vic Drover with us. Me and Vic have worked together in the Joomla world for more than a decade now in all sorts of different ways. And Vic was one of the first people I knew not only to move to the GPL license back in the day as an early Joomla extension developer, but also start to build a remote team for his projects. And in this session, he's going to take us through some of the tough lessons he's learned managing a remote team. He's hired people all over the world and now runs his company based in the US, but with a team that's largely in Europe. Vic, welcome.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. It's really great to be here, and this is important to have these conferences, so really appreciate you putting in the effort. And I think this talk, I first gave it last year, right before the lockdown restrictions, and I hope it's aged well because some of these tips we've had to really double down on them. So I hope everyone gets a little bit of something out of this. So I've been managing digital teams, digital agencies, I guess, for about 2 decades, but that wasn't always the case. I grew up in the 1970s on a remote island in the North Atlantic Ocean. Climate was harsh, we struggled to pay the bills, and life always seemed a little harder than it had to be. This picture of me always makes me laugh. At the start of each school year, our new clothes, if you will, were a mix of hand-me-downs and hand-knit items like this lovely blue gem here. This is my 5th grade picture at school. I would have been about 10 years old here. For breakfast, we didn't have the fancy Honey Smacks cereals like the kids, other kids in the neighborhood. We poured plain puffed wheat from these giant 2-gallon bulk bags of cereal. We just doused them with raw sugar, from the sugar bowl. So things were tight. We had to entertain ourselves in cost-effective ways. And in our free time, we would go hunting and fishing. Here, this is another early photo of me. I think I'm wearing my Boy Scout top there. If we wanted to go out fishing, for example, we had to literally build our wooden raft by hand each spring. Once the wood dried out, of course, you couldn't use it. You had to build a new one every spring. So we had to be creative to make ends meet. But in 1981, something happened that changed my life. And I think some folks, if you're kind of my age, probably had a similar experience. I got an Atari 2600 for Christmas. Okay, look how happy I am in this picture. My parents spent nearly a year making secret trips to the local Woolworths department store. I don't think that exists anymore, to make $5 and $10 installments until it was paid for. My Atari came with one game, Asteroids, and again, some of you will remember the pure bliss that is this very basic video game. Well, it didn't matter how simple it was. I played it nonstop for months, all the while begging my parents for more games. Eventually, my dad just broke down and gave me the hard truth, and he said, "Son, if you want more games, you're going to have to get a job." Okay, so this is where my first introduction to kind of business began. So it was 1982. What could a 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid do? Delivering newspapers. Okay, back then you delivered newspapers by hand, and that's the job I got. Here's a few pics of me back at that time. I even made the local newspaper, you can see. As I said, the conditions were harsh. You can, I think, these photos bear that out. But probably worse, it was a crappy, low-paying job that I was just doing to get more video game cartridges. Now, as I got older, I replaced my home console, my 2600, with frequent trips to the video arcade that really kind of grew into their own at this time. It became kind of the social center of most places for teens in the 80s. I would spend hours and hours pumping quarters into the classic games, right? Pac-Man, Galaga, and my favorite game of all time, which was called Ghosts and Goblins, which you can see here. This was such a high-end game at the time, just fantastic. I get goosebumps just watching this little clip. What I find interesting, just as an aside, is that like killing zombies was popular like long before The Walking Dead hit the TV shows, right? Well, anyway, what do video games and newspaper delivery have to do with remote work and building digital teams and trying to kind of work through these COVID times that we're in right now? Well, I think you can make a strong case that door-to-door sales, which is essentially what newspaper delivery is, it's one of the original remote jobs that you can have. So consider these characteristics of delivering newspapers, okay? It's lonely. You spend a lot of time by yourself, in my case, delivering newspapers. So at the height of my career, I had 300 recurring subscribers. So even back then, I was thinking maybe, I wasn't thinking, but maybe I got the idea from recurring revenue. But it would take me 2 hours a day to hand deliver on foot 300 customers. There were not many newspaper people when I was there. I had a large area to cover. I felt like I was always working. So there were no automated payments at that time. You had to hand collect money, and there were always people, and it seemed like the same 10 or 20 customers every week who didn't pay. We had to go back at lunchtime or on the weekends or in the evenings to try and collect the fees, because at the end of the week, you had to go to the paper company and pay for the papers you had delivered, and anything left over was yours. Collecting that money was time consuming, and it just never allowed me to turn off. Also, there were no professional relationships that I could form at that time. I never saw any other paper carriers. I never met any of the adults working at the newspaper. There was no mentorship, no opportunities to learn anything or move up. It was the same thing day after day. And as I said earlier, I was only in it for the money. Due to the inherent isolation, it was hard to be emotionally invested in this job. And, I just wanted to get home and play video games, right? Or get to the arcade, I guess, eventually. So fast forward to today. I spent the last 15 years building and managing remote teams for both website development and widget development. As Steve said, I started out very early in the Joomla days developing software for running Joomla websites. Currently, I run a SaaS company called Watchful. It's at watchful.net. And we have a team of 6 to 8, depending on where we are with contractors and other staffing issues. And I've seen the problems that I just described firsthand, but interestingly from the other side of the table. So not as, say, an employee, but more as an employer or a leader, team leader situation. So what's important to remember here, this is a picture of our team earlier this year in England at our annual retreat. But I've made lots of mistakes in the last 20 years, and I've tried to learn lessons from them, because if you don't learn those lessons, you keep repeating them. Those lessons, applying the lessons we learned, I think has made remote work more fun and effective. Certainly that's true for me. And I want to share those with you now. So we'll get into the meat of it a little bit. So the first lesson that I learned is that meetings that don't empower people kill. Kill productivity. I should restate that. Meetings that don't empower people kill productivity, kind of like maybe the zombies in my favorite video game. So how many meetings have you been in where folks are rolling their eyes or tuning out, doing something else in the background, just clicking away on their phone? I think this Office Space meme says it all for me, right? We've attended so many poor meetings, we'd rather not have them at all, right? Well, how do you know if you're in a bad meeting, right? Most people, obviously, if you're distracted and not engaged, it's a bad meeting, but a lot of these bad meetings have a lot of things in common. So you're only hearing one person talk. I don't mean at a time, throughout the whole meeting, it's just one person talking continuously with no engagement, no back and forth. So it's very one-sided. No agenda's been presented before the meeting, so you don't necessarily know what to expect. You don't know if there are any goals that you need to address, or when when the meeting's successful, how do you measure that if you don't have goals or an agenda? Oftentimes, no one is keeping things on topic and on time. It's great sometimes to have a meeting where it's casual and loose, but probably those are better to just have a happy hour meeting and forget the work side of it. If you have a work meeting and you need to be productive, you want to keep things on topic and on time. You don't want to waste time either, being there all day, going around in circles, which is very common. And I guess maybe the number one or the easiest way to tell if a meeting was useful or not is whether or not someone could have put it in an email or shared a document with you with the information. So meetings need to, if you're having a meeting, there should be a purpose. There should be some back and forth, something you're trying to get out of it, not just send information. That can be a part of your meeting, but if you're meeting, why are you meeting? To have interaction, to be productive and be effective. So these poor meetings, they kind of illustrate a failure of leadership, right? But more importantly, they deny your remote team, especially even in person. This is true of in-person meetings. They deny this lack of engagement denies your team members the opportunity to take ownership and pride in their work, showcase their efforts, or to leverage their ability to solve problems. And people can kind of hide in meetings, and you may never even know how good they are because you don't give them the opportunity to stand up and show you. So especially remotely and during these really trying last 6-8 months, I feel like your team needs these opportunities. It can't just be kind of robots sitting there distracted and not participating. So at Watchful, we have a weekly all hands on deck meetings every Wednesday morning. We work hard to make them positive and productive. We don't always succeed, but we definitely try to. So importantly, we always have an agenda with a 40-minute time limit, so folks know when to be there and when they're going to leave. If they need to schedule another meeting after, they can, because the meeting is very unlikely to go over. Very rarely it goes over 40 minutes. We try to close the meeting with action items so that we can be productive after the meeting and know what the expectations are for the coming week. And we also try to stay focused and keep people engaged. So one way to do that is to realize that when conversations are either becoming circular, or if we're not getting to a resolution, in an appropriate amount of time, we can cut those conversations, table them either for the next meeting, or this happens quite often. Some folks will say, hey, why don't you and Bill and Sally, why don't we have a separate one-on-one meeting? We can circle back. The two of us are involved. We'll get the answer to this problem, and we can circle back and either send the update electronically or bring it up at the following meeting. Those little one-on-one breakouts that can happen after, like right after, or even the next day and the next couple days, really can help move a meeting along when you've got a diverse group of people with various different responsibilities and projects they might be working on. Now, these meetings, basically in the past, I think I made a very big error that when I wasn't around or I was traveling or unavailable, there'd be no meeting. Let's say in the last 5 years, made a pretty big change to that, so that if I am away or unavailable, someone else can run the meeting. Someone can host the meeting, right? They have the access to our Google Meet, our internal software we use for the meetings, and they can run the meeting and make sure that the work and the productive engagement we have at these meetings can continue. Now, not everyone listening today is leading meetings. Probably most of you are attending meetings on a regular basis, but you're not planning them. So how can you, if you're not planning them, you can be hard to, if you're not in control, maybe improve them. Well, I've got a few tips also for attendees. If you're finding yourself attending these poor meetings, you kind of need to be creative about ways to talk to the organizer, maybe that's your boss, for example, on how to improve them. Depending on their personality, you probably have to have some soft skills, but you could, for example, offer to help write the agenda or help organize the meeting. Maybe say, hey, why don't we, who's going to be in charge of bringing donuts? Ask some subtle, gentle questions to start engaging the organizer so that they start realizing, hopefully, that you're looking for a little more structure. You can gently inquire about a meeting duration. Hey, I need to schedule something else after the meeting. What time do you think we're going to be done? Is it going to be long or short? That sort of thing. And in a meeting, related to what I said earlier, hopefully you have the ability to speak up and suggest a one-on-one follow-up, especially if you're involved in a discussion. Hey, Bill, why don't you and I take this offline or take this to a separate breakout, and I'll circle back with the boss later. So those are a few little tips. I'm sure you can be creative, based on the kind of culture you have at your work. But better meetings, they can actually be fun. They empower people, and they lead to improved productivity or improved outcomes. So do what you can to improve your meetings, whether you're organizing them or attending them. Get better meetings. Definitely better meetings. Okay, the second lesson that I wanted to talk to you about today was about vision and long-term strategy. And the short story is one person's vision is myopic or short-sighted. And I definitely take that on as something that I have done in the past, and I'm going to provide some context to illustrate. So after building my first few hobby websites, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I moved into the widget business, selling, extensions, for Joomla. Basically we had forked a calendar project, which actually Steve now manages. That's one of our ways we've been working together in the last few years. But in the development of that project, we had a lot of early success, and with a few other plugins, we were pretty confident, myself and my partner, that we knew the right features to add and the long-term vision and strategy for the company. For those of you who've been around a while, it was kind of the heyday for content management systems and Joomla in particular. And it was pretty easy to feel like, oh, this success is because I'm doing everything right. Well, despite that initial success, the time we were spending on development wasn't really translating into, say, increased sales, for example. When we created some very affordable commercial plugins, or extensions rather. So in a span of about 5 years, our sales dropped to about 50% of what they were at our peak. And so the business was in such trouble, eventually we decided to pull the plug and move on. It's important, of course, if you're a business owner, to know when maybe you've done your best. Here's a slide from our current, or our old website rather, saying goodbye. It takes a while to process these things. I definitely recommend self-reflection when you've had success or failure, of course. But I finally realized that we probably could have avoided these issues had I shared my vision with the team and asked for their input. I feel like I was too close to the action to make wise decisions at that time. And without the team's input, I was just kind of by myself and, maybe wasn't making the best decisions. And this discourages other people on the team because their voices weren't heard, their expertise wasn't necessarily recognized. So today, and Steve and I collaborated on this a while back, we use a more structured workflow for planning and strategy, and it's centered around team input. So we put together a draft of our 1 to 3 year strategy last year, and we used something, again, that Steve introduced me to, the Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal template. And I'm going to show that to you here. You can find a million of these online, BHAG or BHAG templates. Well, basically, it's a structure for planning your, in this case, a 1 to 3 year plan. It has places for your purpose, core values, strategic priorities, etc. So we start by sending this out to the team, getting their written feedback, and that can just be an email. Again, not everything has to be in a meeting, right? So we get some initial feedback, discuss it on Slack a little, and then we dedicated one of our weekly all-hands meetings to discussing the strategy. What do we want to be? Where do we think we can go? What's within our grasp? And what can we be ambitious about? So that's a great thing to have in a voice meeting or a video conference meeting. But critically, especially for something as important as your short to medium term strategy, it's really great to have these conversations in person. So, after maybe a month of mulling it over kind of digitally and then in a video conference, we actually got together, and here's that same picture of us in London, England last year, where we had not just strategy meetings, lots of meetings, of course, but really breaking down what we want to be, where we want to go, and making the right strategic priorities, putting them into our template and getting set for kind of the next phase of development. So in summary, if you can include your team in these big decisions and these big strategies, you can find that not only do you get some great ideas, but you really get everyone going in the same direction, okay? But it does require patience and humility. So don't let time or, say, your own personal ego be the enemy of a good strategy. Take your time, see what you can do, get the feedback from the people, and really bring them on board. So really don't, in my experience, just relying on my own vision, not sufficient, right? Many eyes are better than one. That's what I say. So the next lesson that I learned and probably ignored for the first 10 years of my work in the digital space was about culture. And basically, good work culture can save your business in really kind of unexpected ways. So to understand my perspective on this one, you have to know that I'm an early adopter, basically in everything. And in general, I'm a very curious person. I'm always chasing the new shiny framework or that next great tool or service. I always update my devices when the early betas come out, and I do a lot of cooking. I'm always buying new kitchen gadgets, to the frustration of my wife. She will love hearing that. So in other words, I'm easily distracted. And when I get a new idea for my business, I'm quick to head down a rabbit hole and start discussing how this widget could integrate over here or be a great fit over there. Or sometimes I'm excited because it just sounds cool. So in the past, I probably would have juggled priorities, switched some directions, probably not gotten much feedback even from my senior engineers, again, because I didn't have the culture that was going to bring those ideas out and give the restraint that's sometimes needed. I think that my team is, my team now does not have that problem. They tell me to slow my roll all the time and remind me of our priorities and commitments. And I think that's, in retrospect, I think that's a great positive. It's good. I'm very appreciative we have that open culture at Watchful. We even came up with an internal proposal process that everyone, including the boss, me, needs to use before updating a roadmap. So when I get a great idea for some new feature, we have a proposal process. Here's a proposal. Here's the details. Cost benefit perhaps, and before we can even get it towards the roadmap, it kind of has to go through a pretty thorough vetting process. This kind of thing only happens if you get the culture right. Otherwise, people won't be bothered to speak up or participate. They won't care. They won't care if I spin my wheels or waste company resources, right? And if they don't feel comfortable telling the boss he's wrong, then you're really going to be in a silo. It really actually narrows your vision, similar to that last point I made. But having good culture is not just about minimizing negative outcomes. In my opinion, culture is, good culture can overcome a lack of skill. Or to say it another way, people can exceed their apparent abilities in the right setting or in the right environment. So how do you create a company with good culture? Well, here's some tips that work for us. Critically, you need to respect people. And I've said here on the slide, respect their time, but I really mean protect their time. So what's the difference? Well, respecting people's time, of course, is being aware and cognizant that, they have things to do outside of work. Actually, even within work, you can't expect them to do everything all at once if you want it done well. So you have to respect their time, but you also need to protect their time. Okay, you need to remember they have a home life and they need a happy home life with friends and family, to have a sustainable and productive work life. You also need to cultivate an environment of learning from mistakes. If every error is met with some huge negative diatribe from, one of your colleagues or from the boss in particular, you're really going to stop hearing about problems very quickly. And that is the absolute last thing you want. When problems come up, you need an open, safe environment for people to let you know what's wrong and so you can figure out how to fix it. Super, super important. Not every problem, requires, some massive dramatic response. Similar to an idea I brought up earlier about empowering people to run meetings when the organizer isn't available, don't be the bottleneck. If you have such a tight control on everything in your business, or even in your project, if you're a project manager or a project leader for maybe you're building a website and you have a team of people working on that, don't be the bottleneck. A, it kills productivity, but B, it doesn't give people the knowledge and access to execute on their own, solve problems, essentially get stuff done. So as much as you can, give people the access they need, the tools they need, the training they need, so that they can move forward. And you're not holding them up because, I don't know, maybe it's your personal time. You're taking a few days off. It could be something simple as making sure people have the right passwords to access, the things they need to move the project forward. Definitely try and make yourself. It's great if you can make yourself completely indispensable. As a business owner, that's what I try to do. You may not want to go that quite as far when you're working in an agency, but definitely don't be the bottleneck when other people can help. The other point that's important, I think, is to meet in person as much as you can. These days, of course, it's impossible to travel primarily, especially if you're in America like we are. But I think regularly scheduling times to meet in person, I don't mean video conference, I mean in person, is really important for building good culture. Okay, it's expensive if you're owning a business. You have to take time away from your family maybe. if you have to travel to meet other members in your remote team. But I think it's worth it, especially if you can mix your work retreats or sprints with fun team activities. Those are really great ways to get to know your colleagues, and that will just have obviously a number of, you can pass on positive things that are going to happen for your team. So in other words, give people the tools and experience so much so that they could leave the business, but treat them so well that they want to stay. Now, those are good tips, I think, if you're running or owning a business or a group inside a larger business. But if you're looking for, say you're making a change, you're looking to get hired, you may want to identify companies with good cultures. That's also important. So how can you identify a company, say, when you're interviewing or looking for a new job? How can you identify companies with good culture? Well, during the interview process, try and ascertain if feedback is welcome. You can ask some careful questions and see if you get shut down quickly or if people are genuinely interested in your opinions on various aspects, of your new job. Are the expectations and hours clearly defined? This is related to having good boundaries for your time and protecting your home life and your work life and making sure there's good separation and good boundaries, as I said. If some of your job requires you to be on call, maybe you're doing support and during the vacation someone needs to be doing some support. Are you the only one? Is everyone going to be involved in that process? These are good questions you can find the answers to early on. What I always like to know, or I guess I appreciate it when people ask me, is the ability to meet with their potential colleagues before being hired. If you can meet with people who you may work with without the boss around, without the hiring manager, you'll get good, honest answers. And a company that's not afraid to put their people out there, they're confident in their culture. And I think that will come through if you can have those private meetings or semi-private meetings without the boss around. And finally, because meeting in person is so important, if you're getting a remote job, find out if they do meet in person. Obviously, not during COVID times, but in general, do they normally do that? Is that important for them for their culture? Okay, I've spent a lot of time on culture because I think it's critical. But if you take one thing away, I would say this: culture is greater than skill. Okay, you need to have some obvious basic skills, especially for high tech type jobs. But the culture long term is needed to foster and recruit people with the skills you need. So if you can't have both, which would be great if you did, make sure you get the culture right first. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Lesson 4. This is about the tools we use, especially in digital agencies, both in-person and remote. Don't let tools reduce your productivity. So remote teams require specialized tools that help close the geographic gap, but also in a digital office, you need those tools for collaboration and working effectively. So these tools make you feel more connected and more productive, but they can also, when misused, hurt your productivity and kind of do away with some accountability. And we don't want that either. So let's look at some tools and take an example so you know what I mean. If you're working in a digital agency, in particular remote workers, but in general, any kind of website agency is probably using a number of tools similar to these. Some video conferencing software like Zoom, which we're using today, of course, to have this conference. Communication tool like Slack. Project management, we use Trello at Watchful, and then a collaboration tool like GitHub. When used properly, these tools can be great, and these are kind of best in class type examples. But if you don't use them properly, or if you don't use them consistently, or if you only use them from time to time, then you might be doing more harm than good. So for example, maybe you're using Trello to track your tasks and your project management. So Trello is visually appealing, easy to use, and the free tier is feature rich. And here's a quick screenshot of Watchful's Trello. I took this morning. And you can see we've got 3 lists for testing, doing, and development. And we've got a done list, which I just simply didn't show for space. You can see that the cards are in various stages of development. We have a list for each stage. But don't let the simplicity fool you. It's pretty easy to add a card in Trello in a way that limits Trello's usefulness or the productivity you might get from this kind of tool. So for example, adding a card without enough detail is a very easy way for there to be a lack of accountability and a lack of productivity. Okay, so not only does someone looking at that card not know what they might need to do, but it's kind of, I see it as kind of like an insult. If you've got a card that someone else has to work on and you haven't put in the legwork to describe properly and fully the problem, what needs to be sorted, and what the expectations are, then you put that task on another person. Before they can even start solving the problem, they have to figure out details of the problem, right? Have the respect for your colleagues. If you're going to open something in your project management, put in the appropriate details so that the next person can be productive and get forward to solving the problem, not just solving the communication issue. Another thing in project managers, of course, are assigning tasks to folks. So in Trello, you can obviously assign them to people. You can see the avatars here, and these cards are linked to the people that are assigned to do them. If you fail to assign a task to somebody, or you assign it to the wrong person, that card can just sit there and get overlooked. No one knows who's supposed to be doing it, right? Not everyone has a notification every time a new card gets created. Not everyone's checking that the cards are assigned properly. So take the time to make sure that someone's assigned to it. And probably you need some workflow that, before you remove yourself from a card, you assign it to someone else. So little internal workflows that keep things moving. If it's important enough to be in your Trello or in your project manager and it needs to get done, move it down the line until it's, all the way into your done column and, archived so that you can move on to the next project. The other item, and bosses like me are famous for this kind of thing, is adding an urgent label to every task, okay? So when everything is urgent, nothing is urgent, right? So truly urgent items then get lost in the noise and, priorities are just simply misaligned. So I hope these examples show how easy it is to divert responsibilities and confuse priorities. We use lots of tricks, or rather just good workflows, for getting Trello to work the way we want. And but this can happen with any tool. GitHub is similar. Slack can be, maybe you tag someone in Slack and you think that's enough for them to do something, and probably not, right? So we schedule regular review of all our workflows, especially Trello. And these discussions and training for new folks on how they use the tool are important, and it's important that you keep up on them. We used to have a label for urgent. We eventually got rid of it because we essentially use Trello's ordering system. If it's at the top of a list, it's next on the list to be done. We don't have a done label anymore because we have a done list. Why do we need both those things? So these are little tweaks that we added over as our workflow has developed, but they're basically just standard operating procedures for that tool that we all kind of follow internally. The harder task, of course, is building a culture of urgency for tasks and projects. But what's clear is if you use your tools incorrectly, you can't really get to that building of the culture of urgency because you kind of lose that accountability if you're not using your tools properly. It doesn't sound sexy to be regularly looking at workflows for the tools you use, but those things can often be the most important for having a team that's working well as a unit. And this slide, I should have said earlier, is a simple template that Trello has. GitHub issues have templates that you can make also, and many tools will have something similar when it comes to productivity. So we use this kind of simple template. You can see this is a template card. You click that green button at the top right, and you simply get a copy of this card in the right list and with the various fields to fill out. And if you don't fill them out, this card probably shouldn't be submitted. And that's kind of how we use our project manager at Watchman. Okay, we're getting long in the tooth, so we'll finish up here pretty quick. The last item kind of brings together a few of the things we've talked about, conversation and culture. And essentially, it's that text-based conversations can kill your culture and your productivity. And by that, I mean, if you're only texting, a lot can get lost, and sometimes very little can get done. Now, if you work remote so much recently, like many of us have, I'm sure there are days when you're in your PJs and you've got a scheduled video call, and you're like, I'm just going to hop into Slack and type out this instead. I'm not ready to jump online. Well, look, we've all been there, but from my perspective, face-to-face calls are always worth the effort. There's really no text-based messaging option that can substitute for a face-to-face conversation ideally, or at a minimum, a phone call, an audio call. So misunderstandings are less frequent. This one I love. Both of you can work in the same tool at the same time. That is super efficient. Trello is great at that. Google Docs, for example, if you're working on content, really, really good way to be productive is to both use the same tool at the same time. So because the communication and productivity is better, issues are resolved faster, and I think you just form better work relationships. And so video meetings are now my 100% preferred way to communicate with my colleagues. And if you and your team are spending less time chatting, I recommend a switch to more video meetings, as many as you can get, even if they're one-on-ones, as we discussed earlier, for having productive meetings. Okay, well, I'm just going to jump to the summary here. Here's the short story. I've made tons and tons of mistakes managing remote teams and digital teams over the years. Okay, but here are the top 5 things we're doing today to have a more effective, more productive business. Use meetings to empower people, create your vision as a team, work very, very hard on the culture, use your tools wisely. Don't let them be ways to shirk accountability. And finally, talk face-to-face whenever possible. So as a result of applying these principles, in the past few years, I've kind of had a renewed sense of calm and confidence, and I see that in my teammates as well. Work is more enjoyable, it's more productive. My work-life balance has improved immeasurably, and if there are any Watchful users or followers out there, you've seen a lot of that content on our blog the last year or so, because it's really been a big change for us. Most importantly, and this was the big problem I had when I was delivering newspapers back in the 80s, I'm now able to step away from the PC and spend quality time with my family and friends. I don't have that feeling of always working or always being online. And I've even made time to return to my original guilty pleasure, gaming. Okay, so here's a great few photos that we took a few years ago. My brother and I built a stand-up multi-game arcade system. We put a gaming emulator on a Raspberry Pi, if any of you are into that kind of technology. And you can see on the right-hand side, my youngest daughter got to experience original versions of these classic old school games. And so I'm really glad she doesn't have to, schlep around for 2 hours delivering newspapers just to have a little fun. All right, well, that's it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Please feel free to reach out. I'm on Twitter, on email. And thank you for your attention.
Hey, Vic. So if you got someone who is starting a remote company today, maybe they've got laid off, maybe they're starting a side project and hiring people, do you have one single thing that you would tell them above any other? I'll start with my personal tip, and maybe we'll get some suggestions from the people in the chat. The one thing that's worked for my schedule is only to work remotely with people in the same time zone. That's been the one thing that has kept me to a regular schedule. I've avoided late night meetings or very early meetings by being based in North America and only hiring people North America, Central America, or South America. That would be my number one tip. Do you have something like that? Something that's been like an overriding principle that you'd pass on to people?
Yeah, I mean, that could probably drone on, I'm sure. But I would say what it took me a while to realize is that before kind of making the big step to hire someone full-time, or maybe for 20, 30 hours a week, something like that, start with some small projects. See how the fit is, see how the communication is, see how the new person fits into your existing workflow. I'm always open to changes in workflow. But for example, at Watchful, we have a closed Google Drive folder. You can only access it if you log in with a Watchful domain email. So some folks, they don't like to do that. They want to share out to their personal Gmail. I'm thinking, in this case, contractor. That doesn't work for us. If someone insists on that, we have to say, well, that doesn't quite work because we need this information in this way for security reasons. That's an example of something we're not prepared to bend on. So you learn that very quickly in a small project, a 10, 15-hour project, if they're going to fit into your existing workflow. Have them attend a meeting, ask them about what they're doing, invite them to a social meeting you're having with your team, and just see what the fit is like. I think the fit is most important, and I find that's a really good low risk way when you're working with strangers you haven't met and you don't know personally, and maybe can't be held accountable locally because they're in another country, for example. That's a really good way to start.
Would you move back to an office if someone offered you a good, reliable team based, say, 20 minutes from your house in an office? Would you go back to an office culture?
So I've been working remotely a long time, and I've had this beautiful home office. I'm very lucky for many years, and it's my dedicated place. I see my kids every morning off to school. I'm right here. They come home. I'm with them. I mean, they're getting a little bigger now, so maybe that would factor into it. I actually looked at an office 2 years ago and strongly considered it, but it was essentially, should I get another full-time employee or pay rent in an office? And it was kind of a no-brainer. So unless I hit the sweepstakes tomorrow, I mean, I would love to have more in-person meetings, but I would rather spend that rent money bringing my team to London, or bringing them to I want to go to Italy next, or somewhere else. That would be, for me, a priority versus if I had to choose, I would choose more travel, less office. But I'm not against the office necessarily.
I think that's particularly true because we're in a fairly niche industry. If we were realtors, you could hire a whole bunch of realtors just in your local neighborhood and set up an office. Whereas working in the development world, particularly in a niche like PHP and Joomla, the chances of being able to find a reliable developer within 20 minutes of you are pretty much zero.
Now, if we have a couple watchful customers who have large local website owners that they manage. So basically hosting management companies, they got 100 local clients. They probably don't want to be remote. They still might work from home, but they want to be their clients. They're meeting with them in person. So then maybe you need an office. So it also depends. Is the audience that is listening right now more making websites for a living? Or are they more writing code for a living and writing programs for a living? That also might change it. If you're interacting with clients locally and you prefer to do that locally, having an office makes sense. So it's hard. I think it's harder to be professional meeting at a local meetup office space, for example.
And my final question, and I'm not sure if anyone in the chat has a question to wrap up with as well. Do you find your workday is significantly changed by working remotely? Are you up extra early to keep in touch with your team in Europe? And I think your team is not even necessarily in Western Europe, but you have some people a little further afield in Romania, for example. Do you find that remote work is disruptive to your day in terms of what time you have to get up and what time you hold meetings?
Yeah, I think it used to be, Steve, but I honestly can say that because I don't think I'm a micromanager like I used to be. And at that time, I absolutely interrupted my schedule because I had to be present and ready for everything. But I get up in the morning now and I just start going through my email, looking at closed issues on GitHub, make sure nothing jumps out at me that's weird. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Oh, I'll follow up with that at the meeting. And I find I get up early because that's the way my clock works, my personal clock, but not because I want to talk to my European colleagues. I guess I would say the other side of it, because we need to provide support essentially 24/7, 365, that having folks in other time zones helps response times on support requests. So if someone from Australia, we've got lots of customers in Australia, if they say, hey, if we get a support request at 10 p.m. my time, by 1 a.m. my time, the European folks are getting up and starting work, and so they can actually at least get an initial reply back to some of those folks and move it forward more quickly. So there are pluses and minuses. For me, I think, and the way it's working with our current team, I don't find it disruptive, but I definitely used to.
Okay, you feel like you've grown a little bit in terms of being more comfortable with asynchronous communication, being less of a micromanager, putting more trust in your team.
100%. Trust in your team. If you can't trust them, then you're in trouble.
Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Vic.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you again, Steve.